have to confess that before I had a YouTube channel, I really didn't watch YouTube much at all. I was more of a book reader, and I just didn't watch YouTube. Didn't know hardly anything about it. I never even considered how much could be in the descriptions under the various videos. And after I got on YouTube, I got a little curious and started watching other videos. And before long, I was kind of hooked. I probably have watched too many YouTube videos and wasted some time. But one type of video that kind of intrigues me would be the videos that talk about people that have reached 100 years of age or 90 years of age. And they say, I've done it by eating these 5 foods or these 7 foods, or I avoid these 4 foods. And I'm always kind of curious, all right, what do they eat? What do they avoid? How did they make it so far? To me, to live to be 80 is doing pretty well, especially if you do it in good health. 85, better still. 90, that just seems so far away and so almost impossible, but who knows? At any rate, I watched a video the other day. It was about a lady named Ida Keeling, who became well known as a competitive runner. She began her running while in her 60s. I think she was 67 when she started, and became pretty well known as a runner, and she won a number of medals. Of course, she was winning the medals for beating others in her age bracket. It's not like she was beating the 20-year-olds. But in her 70s, 80s, and 90s, she was running competitively. And when the video was made, I believe she was still alive. I think she was probably around 105. I looked on Google or Wikipedia, and it said she died at 106. So she lived a good long while. And of course, they attribute part of it to her active lifestyle, her running, and I don't doubt that had a role to play. And I was kind of curious because the video talked about, I think it was the 5 foods that she eats that help keep her going. So I was curious, all right, what are the 5 foods? And they listed them. One was garlic, which I don't have a problem with, olive oil. I use olive oil myself. Berries, same with berries. Leafy greens, sure. The last one was the only one that I had a problem with, whole grains, brown rice, quinoa, and oats. And they really went on and on about how nutritious whole grains are for you. Let me give you a quote. Whole grains are a delicious and nutritious addition to Ida's diet, helping to fuel her active lifestyle and support her longevity. Nutritious, delicious. They fuel her longevity. They make her live longer. Well, no doubt about it, if you're going to eat grains, it's better to eat whole grains than it is to eat white flour type of grains. Better to have some oats than eat a cinnamon roll. And really all of her list, compared to the way most Americans eat, it's quite good. Garlic, that's certainly superior to going to McDonald's and eating French fries. Olive oil is good, and almost everybody acknowledges that's a healthy thing. Berries, well, if someone said eat a bowl of berries or a bowl of Fruit Loops or Fruity Pebbles or Cocoa Puffs or Cheerios, I would go with the berries. Leafy greens, no problem there at all. Benedicta often puts leafy greens in her soup, her spinach and okra soup. And spinach, of course, is a leafy green. The whole grains, again, that would be the one area I would have a problem with. They just don't work well for diabetics. But we're going to talk about why some of these centenarians, they call them, people that live to be 100 or more, can get by eating those kinds of foods. Another example, I've talked about him before, Dick Van Dyke. I think he is around 97 at this time, or 98, somewhere in his upper 90s. He eats berries practically every day. He eats apples practically every day. He makes a smoothie with beets and apples and carrots and chia seeds and some coconut water. That's how he gets off to a start for his day. His next meal is almost always the same, according to what this video indicated, which is he starts with a bowl and he puts some raisin bran at the bottom, and then he tops it with wheat bran. and then he may put some fruit in it. Well, that would be a nightmare for me. I couldn't possibly do it. It would be for almost any diabetic. But Dick Van Dyke obviously is not diabetic, and he gets by with it. Watched a video about Jane Fonda. Jane Fonda, she's a relatively youngster. She's in her 80s. But anyway, she eats breakfast all the time. She says it's the most important meal of the day, and she will usually have something with oatmeal in it and often put nuts and raisins with it. Again, would not be a good choice for me at all, but again, she could get by with it. So let me just give you a few thoughts about the people that are getting old and they're still doing very, very well, and specifically the centenarians, although technically Ida was the only centenarian of the three I mentioned. Dick Van Dyke is upper 90s, Jane Fonda in her 80s. But if you are 100 or more, that means you were born in 1924 as of the making of this video, which means you probably went through the first third of your life and you just ate whatever you wanted. I'll never forget watching a video quite some time ago, but it was a video where they found people that were 100 or older and they interviewed them. And the one question they asked every one of them was, well, what do you eat? And I was astounded. Now, this was before I was even low carb. And so I was curious, though, because I was always somewhat interested in nutrition and diet. So they asked all these people, 100 or more, what do you eat? Again, this would have been maybe 25 years ago that I saw this. And their answer was identical. Whatever I want. I just eat whatever I want. Well, if you were, now considering this was 20-some years ago, that meant these people were probably born around 1900. And the food pyramid hadn't even been promoted for most of their life. They were probably in their 60s before people got the idea that you should eat low fat and avoid red meat of all kinds. So, but people in those days, born in 1900, 1910, 1920 even, the centenarians of today, born in 1924 or so, they were born in an age where people didn't take nutrition very seriously. People were just struggling so much just to eat. They were just happy to have a meal in front of them, especially into the 1930s where America suffered what we call the Great Depression. And there was very little money. Jobs were hard to get. And what jobs you could get didn't pay much. And my mom has told me about that. She was a girl growing up in the Great Depression, the 1930s. And they were just happy to have a meal. And their meal was generally the cheapest meal you could get, which was cornbread and some kind of beans on top. Cornbread and beans. That was their standard Depression fare. And they were happy to get it. Nobody was talking about, well, that's too much high carbs. They didn't worry about that. They just wanted to live another day and get their bellies full. So a lot of the people that are now 100 or more, they were born and they reached adulthood without ever thinking about nutrition very much at all. But the fact they made it to 100 means that there's a pretty good likelihood many of them reached a point in their life where they did start to concern themselves with nutrition. Dick Van Dyke is a good example, and he talks about how he avoids red meat, and he eats a lot of fruits and whole grains and so forth. Well, that's what they told us back in the 70s and 80s and 90s. If you hit your peak, and a lot of the centenarians did just that. They hit their stride, they hit their peak, they reached their maximum potential in their career in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s throughout those 30, 40 years. And everybody was saying low fat, low fat, low fat, no red meat, or if you're going to have a little red meat, the tiniest, scrawniest, leanest red meat you can possibly find. And nobody was saying anything different except Dr. Atkins and Dr. Yunkin was saying our problem is not red meat, our problem is sugar. But very few people were saying that. And so the average person, my mom included, that grew up in that time of the 30s and 40s, and then they hit their stride, hit their adult career peak in the 60s, 70s, 80s, maybe 90s. That's all they knew. That's all anybody was ever saying was that's what you do. If you were health conscious. Now, if you weren't, and a lot of people were not, and they just ate whatever they wanted to, but if you were the least bit health conscious, you would avoid red meat. You would eat low fat because that's what they were telling you to do. And like a good obedient boy or girl, that's what you would do. And typically you would do other things as well. You would tend to exercise. You would avoid a lot of junk food, avoid a lot of sugary food. And those are the kind of people that typically would make it into their older age. And so it's not so surprising when we find centenarians are, what's the word for 90s? Nonagenarians or whatever it is, and people that live into their 90s, they typically kind of followed the standard advice they were taught in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. There was no keto diet in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s to speak of. I know they used a keto-type diet for epilepsy and severe diabetes, but to the general public, it was not known. There were no vegans, there were no carnivores. There just weren't any of those kind of things. People typically ate, as I said, whatever they wanted. So you can't really tell too much except the people that made it to 100 now, the 100-year-old folks these days, probably having good genes and a good attitude may be the biggest factors. In most cases, it really wasn't diet, although they don't eat a lot of junk. That's one thing they probably have all in common. But don't be overly impressed. And when you see a video, well, I'm 105 and here are the 6 foods I've been eating all my life and so forth, I wouldn't be too impressed. Now, the day will come when those of us that have seen the keto diet some will reach 100. Can't guarantee I will for sure. Or anybody else, that's in God's hands. But so there will be some that reach 100. It'll be interesting to see the percentage of vegans versus carnivores versus ketos versus ketovores versus eat whatever you like and so forth. But that day's not here right now. I'm one of the older guys who has been low carb. I started low carb in 2002. And so there aren't too many that have been low carb as long as I am. Of course, Dr. Richard Bernstein beats me all over the place. He started low carb, I think, back in the 50s. I'm not sure, but a lot longer than I have. And he's doing well, and he's just about 90. So he ranks up there. And if he were to tell you what he eats, well, if you follow this channel, that he eats very low carb. But most people would be shocked to see his diet and the foods that he eats. Another factor for these people that get interviewed, a lot of them would be embarrassed to admit they eat very much meat. Some of them probably do eat meat quite a bit, but they wouldn't admit it. If somebody is coming and says, well, we want to show the world how you eat, and we want to encourage them to eat healthy, having lived through the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s where everybody was telling you meat is evil, meat is the devil, meat is horrible, meat will kill you, they'd probably be ashamed to admit that they eat meat. And yet they may well eat meat. So to kind of sum up, our world is in the process of creating a new generation of centenarians, a new generation of people that make it to 100. Will I be there? Who knows? Will you be there? Who knows? But you could be. And as far as I'm concerned, and traditionally people have said, the biggest dietary factor is nutrition. If you can jam enough vitamins and jam enough minerals and take enough supplements and eat enough fruit and vegetables, that's your best chance. Research is showing that it's not really so much what you eat that's going to put off the Grim Reaper. It's what you don't eat. Stop eating the pretzels and the chips and the Little Debbie snack cakes and the cinnamon rolls and the donuts and all the sugary treats and all the white flour products. And while you're at it, you can get rid of most of the whole wheat products and get rid of the white rice. And while you're at it, don't eat very much brown rice. Let me say it again. It's not so much what you eat that's going to be the issue for you living into your 80s, 90s, 100s. It's what you don't eat. Why is that? Because as far as we're learning today, the biggest problem for our health is high glucose and high insulin levels. If you've recently been diagnosed with diabetes and you've just discovered this channel, let me recommend that you go to our Uploads page, which will give you access to every diabetic video we've posted since we began. As you work your way through all our videos, I believe you'll find the help you need. A link to our Uploads page is in the description.